Once upon a time, in a world where shadows kissed the edges of forests and ancient castles loomed on distant hills, a maiden of the woods and a vampire lord fell in love. Their love was the kind whispered about in fables, where hearts burned bright against the odds of a dark and uncertain world. For many years, they were inseparable, best friends, companions, lovers. Together, they weathered every storm, bound by something deeper than words, a mutual bond deeper than even time itself. Yet their love was not without difficulty. The maiden, with her red hair and vibrant spirit, belonged to the wild forest. She thrived among the trees and rivers where sunlight danced through the leaves. The vampire, pale and eternal, was tethered to his ancient castle, a relic of a long-lost age. He could not linger far from its cold stone halls, and she could not remain away from the forest that called to her soul. Their love pulled them together, while their natures pushed them apart, like two celestial bodies caught in each other's orbit, but always just out of reach. Despite their distance, they found ways to stay close, each visit a stolen moment, each parting a silent promise to return. One day, a dark force crept into their lives, something neither love nor time could easily mend. The vampire lord grew ill with a sickness of the blood that no magic or medicine could cure. The undead are notoriously difficult to heal, and this disease gnawed at him from the inside, ravaging his strength, hollowing him further with each passing moon. When the vampire could bear the suffering no longer, he resolved to journey into hell itself in search of death. The maiden, against his wishes, insisted on accompanying him. Her love for him was too strong to let him go alone. But before they set off, the vampire gave her his soul, a precious gift and something most immortals would never part with. He entrusted it to her so that she would have the strength to survive the journey ahead. Together, hand in hand, they descended through the gates of hell. Hell is a place of relentless decay, where the very air gapes foul with miasma, thick and corrosive. The deeper they ventured, the sicker they both grew. The maiden, still being among the living, struggled against the void of time and space clawing at her body. The vampire, already weakened by his illness, found that his condition worsened with every step they took. The infernal atmosphere fed his sickness, making each breath feel like knives in his chest, knives which cut away slivers of his mind and body with each passing moment. As they staggered through the depths of the underworld, their hope began to wane. Finally, they reached the river Styx, the boundary between life and death, where the ferryman waited to carry souls to their eternal rest. Death waited patiently, as is customary for the passing of an immortal. The maiden and the vampire had done it, but both collapsed at death's feet, unable to go any further. They were half blind with madness, and the vampire's eyes were fluttering with the last echoes of consciousness. Desperate to complete their mission, the maiden called out to death.
"Please take my beloved,"
she begged.
"His body is a prison of pain. He can find no comfort in life. Please bring peace to my vampire."
Death shook her head gently and answered in a voice like shifting gravel.
"He is immortal. Even as sick as he is, he must cross over of his own accord. I cannot take him."
The maiden's heart sank. She could feel the despair creeping in as she realized the vampire was too weak to make that choice. He could not live, but he could not die either. They were trapped in a cruel limbo, and there was no path forward. The vampire lord, struggling to remain conscious, produced a sealed letter from his coat and placed it in the maiden's trembling hands. He laid down on the banks of the river Styx and fell into a deep slumber. The maiden expected Death to take the letter, but Death only stared. Confused, the maiden looked and found the letter was addressed to Fate.
Are you and Fate one and the same?
The maiden asked as delirium crept further into the edges of her vision.
No.
Death replied, in a voice heavy with ancient knowledge.
You will find Fate far to the north in the mountains.
The maiden was left with a terrible choice. Stay with her dying love or journey to seek Fate's intervention. Knowing she could not endure hell much longer, she sliced her palm and set her blood to spill into the vampire's lips, giving him what little strength she could before leaving. Out of hell, across the world and up a mountain, the maiden went. She knocked on the door of a humble cabin at the top of a tall peak. From inside, a voice called,
"Who knocks on Fate's door?"
It was a rhetorical question, for you see, Fate knew all things and every choice before it is made. He had been expecting her. The maiden, weary and desperate, held out the letter.
Dear Fate, I have come to plead for the life or death of my beloved. Please consider this letter or anything I can trade you in exchange. You need only ask.
Fate smiled, a slow, wicked grin that stretched across his face.
"You offer me nothing I do not already possess. You cannot bargain with what has already been written. Your letter was dust before it even reached me."
With a wave of his hand, the letter disintegrated from the maiden's bony fingers, vanishing into the cold mountain wind.
"Go home, little maiden. You have failed."
Heartbroken and defeated, the maiden returned to her forest, convinced that she had abandoned the one person she loved most. Years passed. The vampire lord lay in a deep, dreamless slumber by the river Styx, oblivious to the flow of time. The world moved on without him, but he remained unmoved, unaware of the maiden's journey or the outcome of their desperate quest. When he finally awoke, disoriented and alone, the memories of their encounter with death were but distant shadows, vague and elusive. The mission that had driven him into the depths of hell felt like a dream he could no longer grasp. And of the letter, the one that had sent the maiden from hell to seek Fate, he remembered nothing. All he knew was that she was gone. Weakened but alive, the vampire lord returned to his castle. The sickness that had ravaged him before their descent into hell had mostly resolved during his long rest, burning itself out in the fiery abyss. But the emptiness left in his heart was not so easily healed. The weight of her absence gnawed at him, and he did not know why she had gone or what had driven her away. Meanwhile, the maiden withdrew to her forest, her sanctuary far from the vampire's shadowed halls. Though they were no longer bound by the same quest, their stories remained intertwined in subtle ways. Townsfolk spoke of them in hushed tones, rumors of a vampire lord who haunted his castle like a ghost, and a woman who lived alone in the woods, touched by both sunlight and shadow. And so they remained apart, neither daring to reach out. The weight of their separation, forged in the fires of hell, was too much to bear. The pain of their journey lingered between them, like an unspoken truth, too raw and too real for either to confront. Time passed, and they lived as shadows of themselves, each haunted by the other, connected yet apart. Seasons came and went. One quiet summer day, a letter appeared in the vampire's castle, fluttering down from the rafters. The letter bore only one word in a curved script at the bottom of the blank page. It was signed, Fate. Intrigued, the vampire journeyed to the northern mountains. The cabin was rustic and simple, standing in stark contrast to the grandeur of the immortal who dwells within. On his porch, Fate lounged in a weathered wicker chair, idly tossing a small stone in his hand. His appearance was both disarming and unsettling, an ancient god wrapped in a cloak of casual indifference. The stone he tossed was so small and insignificant, yet each flick of his wrist felt like the casual reshaping of worlds. The two shared a formal silence, and Fate gestured to the seat beside him. The air was thick with unspoken questions, but Fate only smirked as he tossed the stone higher.
You know why I'm here,
the vampire lord finally said, breaking the silence. Fate caught the stone midair and gave a languid, knowing smile. With a voice like wind through dry leaves, he replied,
I know everything, remember?
He let out a long, exaggerated sigh as if the conversation were already tedious.
You survived hell and it cost you so much. You don't remember, but you sent her to find me with a blank letter of your own making. Quite the clever ruse, I must say. You sent her away from hell on a fool's errand, a decoy to spare her if things went sideways. You hoped for her survival even if you perished. Humans do make life so complicated.
The vampire said nothing and nodded in agreement.
And now?
Fate asked, his cold eyes searching.
Do you still care for her happiness?
I do.
The vampire replied quietly.
Does she live well?
Fate's eyes gleamed with a mischievous light as he leaned back in his chair, stretching like a lazy cat.
What is well for a human is none of my business, but she survived quite a long journey back to her forest. Now she is about to marry some handsome prince. Isn't that rich?
The vampire's expression darkened for a moment, though he remained composed.
Does she love him?
Fate waved his hand dismissively as though the question was also beneath him.
Love, hate, devotion, betrayal, it's all the same thing in the grand scheme of things. Mortals and their little emotions, so fleeting.
He smirked, clearly enjoying the vampire's discomfort.
But no, not really. She still pines for you, of course. Poor thing, she thinks she failed you. How tragic.
The vampire remained silent, his mind racing with thoughts of the maiden. Fate, sensing his internal turmoil, grinned wider, clearly savoring the vampire's discomfort. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his palm, eyes glinting with that chaotic, meddling energy that defined him.
Here is a secret for you,
Fate said, leaning in as though sharing a great revelation.
You and the maiden, you were never meant to survive that journey. She was supposed to die right there at the sticks. That was the path all along, but you were far too clever for that. You gave her your soul, set her on a wild chase after me, and in doing so, you broke the path.
He winked.
And I love that.
Why tell me this now?
The vampire asked, his voice hardening. Fate shrugged.
Why not? Maybe it's because I'm bored. Maybe it's because you're one of the few undead who's ever managed to surprise me. Or maybe,
he said, grinning wickedly,
I just want to see what you'll do with the knowledge.
The vampire lord returned from the northern mountains, the weight of Fate's words pressing heavily on his mind. Fate had revealed the truth he sought. His love, his maiden, still cared for him. She was alive, but she was not his. Not anymore. Back in the cold, empty halls of his ancient castle, the vampire lord moved silently through shadowed corridors. His footsteps echoed off the stone, each step a reminder of the countless lifetimes he had endured. But now time felt unbearably slow. Knowing she lived but was lost to him gnawed at his already aching heart. Yet he could not intervene. She was to be wed. A prince, a mortal like her, had come to claim her hand. He could offer her a life free of their shared burdens, the weight of eternity, the scars from their journey through hell. She would have a normal life, filled with light, laughter, and a love untainted by darkness. Could he take that from her? Could he pull her back into his world of shadows? No. The vampire lord settled himself in his study, the dim firelight casting flickers across the ancient walls. He stared out of the window toward the distant forest, the forest that had always been hers. He could still see her there in his mind, dancing through the trees, the sunlight shimmering off her wild red hair, her laughter brightening the air. That world had always belonged to her, a place of life that stood in stark contrast to his dark, eternal existence. His chest ached with longing, both familiar and distant. He could summon her, call her name, and she would come. She had promised him that every time they departed. I will always be your person. You need only call my name. But he would not call. He would not summon her from the life she was building, no matter how much it cost him to remain silent. She had suffered enough for him, endured enough. She deserved peace, even if that peace was found in the arms of another. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. His loyal servant entered, footsteps soft on the stone floor.
My lord, the maiden has sent a message. She requests an audience with you.
The vampire lord stilled, his eyes closed, letting the weight of those words settle over him. She was coming. She had not forgotten him, even as she prepared for a new life.
What shall I tell her?
The servant asked gently, sensing the gravity of the moment. The vampire lord remained silent. He could refuse to see her, spare them both the pain of a final meeting. He could send a cold message, a rejection that would push her fully into the arms of the prince, into the future she deserved. But he could not.
Prepare the library,
He said at last, his voice low but steady.
I will see her.
The servant bowed and left the room, leaving the vampire alone once more. He rose from his seat and moved towards the hearth, the warmth of the fire doing nothing to ease the cold in his bones. Memories flickered in the flames, memories of love, loss, and the harrowing journey through hell that had nearly destroyed them both. He would not disrupt her life. He would not beg her to stay. But he could not deny her this one final meeting, this last chance to say goodbye. Far away, In the heart of the Maiden's forest, a prince had indeed asked for her hand. The prince was kind, noble, and everything she should have wanted, but her heart was bound to another. She had loved the vampire lord more entirely than anyone before or after. Even now, as she prepared for a new life, she could not quell the pull towards him and their orbit. She believed he must despise her. Why else had he never come for her upon his return? She had left him in the underworld believing it was her only choice. She thought she had failed him, had become a monster unworthy of his love. Yet she could not let another take her hand without telling him, without making peace with their past. To her surprise, the vampire had agreed to see her. She arrived at his castle with her heart racing, unsure of how he would receive her. Would he hate her, reject her, or would he be the same man she had always known, the one she had loved so fiercely? The grand library was just as she remembered, vast and filled with the tomes of time. The vampire lord stood by the window, bathed in the pale light of the evening, his silhouette a dark shadow against the world outside. His presence, so familiar, stirred a torrent of emotions within her. For a long, breathless moment they stood in silence, the space between them heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Their eyes locked, each searching the other's face for answers, for understanding, as if the vast distance of time and suffering could somehow be bridged in a single moment. At last the maiden broke the silence, her voice trembling.
I am to marry another,
she whispered, her words heavy with grief.
but know that no matter where I go or who I am with, I will always love you. You need only call my name, and I will come.
The vampire's gaze softened.
I love you too,
he replied, his voice barely above a whisper.
I stayed away hoping you had found the peace and happiness you deserve. I could not give you those things, but all I have ever wanted is for you to be happy.
Tears welled in the maiden's eyes. The relief of hearing his words, of knowing he did not despise her, was a dream made real. The world whirred, and her body went slack with relief as she began to faint. In a flash, the vampire was beside her, his arms catching her before she could fall. He held her tightly in an embrace so familiar and grounding. Time slowed around them, very air stilling, as if the universe itself acknowledged the return of their orbit and the depth of their bond. The scars they had carried from their journey through hell began to soften. From that moment they knew they belonged to each other. They always had. From that day forward, their bond was unbreakable, stronger than life, stronger than death, stronger than fate. For their connection was a love that even hell itself could not destroy.